Welcome to Roadmap. It's a special edition of Roadmap on the Road, live from Tel Aviv, Israel. I came to Israel earlier this week to cover the funeral of 4 victims of that terror attack at a kosher supermarket in Paris. And earlier at that funeral in Jerusalem, we heard from the Israeli Prime Minister, who addressed the hundreds of mourners that were there, as well as the families of those victims. The Israeli Prime Minister, as well as the President, touched on a very important point, and he said, our President was right when he said that Jews have the right to live in many countries, and it is their right to live in perfect safety. But I believe that they know deep in their hearts that they have only one country, the state of Israel, the historic homeland that will accept them with open arms like beloved children. Jewish immigration from France to Israel has been on the rise over the past several years. In fact, last year, 7,000 Jews made that journey from France to Israel. Now, in the wake of these deadly terrorist attacks, the Jewish agency here expects that number almost to double. Some say as many as 50,000 Jews from France are expected to make that journey here to Israel. But it has also sparked a wider debate both in Europe and here in Israel. And that question revolves around whether, with the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, should the Jewish population in Europe be encouraged to immigrate here to Israel, or should they be required or encouraged and helped to stay in Europe? And with us to have this discussion, both from Jerusalem as well as here from Tel Aviv, we're joined by Dr. Esther Lopatin. She's the head of the European Studies Department at the IDC, the Interdisciplinary Center at Herzliya. And with us also from Jerusalem is David Fachler, a opinion writer, freelance opinion writer, who wrote an interesting piece this week in Haaretz, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to start off with you, Dr. Esther, and ask you, first of all, paint for us a picture of how big of a problem anti-Semitism is in Europe. Is this an exaggerated problem, or is this a real, tangible problem?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think what we're witnessing now is kind of a new type of anti-Semitism, because traditionally anti-Semitism was associated with the Christian right in Europe. And now actually it seems that, especially in the light of the recent terrorist attacks, but also in 2012 in Toulouse, in 2012 in Belgium, it's more associated with the radical Islam. So there's a change in the origin of anti-Semitism, especially in Western Europe. And interesting enough, like ironically, right extreme parties in Europe who traditionally have been very anti-Semitic, now becoming supportive of Israel and talking about the need to protect Jews and Israelis. And just to give you an example, for example, like in Austria, the Freedom Party, like 10, 15 years ago, under Jörg Haider, it was a very anti-Semitic party, and now Strache, who's the leader of the party, is a very supportive of Israel. In Netherlands, with Wilders, or like even Le Pen, itself. Like the father, of course, was very anti-Semitic. The daughter, Marine Le Pen, she's very cautious about this, because some of her voters are, in fact, also French Jews. So we do see a change in the type of anti-Semitism, especially in Western Europe.
Are you seeing it also reflected in some of the legislation? Are you seeing anything on a pan-European level? I know in the last couple of years, when the issue of the hijab came up in France, it was also, some saw that it was also anti-Semitic because it restricted what Jews can wear when they go into public spaces or universities and stuff. Is it different on the national level or legislative level in Europe?
We don't really see it a lot, any legislation about it. I think we also have to remember that when it comes to immigration or in general, it has to be dealt at the EU level rather than the national level. But I think that in general, there's not much discussion about it. And I think this is one of the arguments that are being made nowadays in Europe, by the French public, but also in particular by the German public, that there is a kind of a disconnect between the people and the leadership. And it seems that the leadership dismiss, their fears. And some of them, of course, are irrational, but some of them, has to be taken into consideration. For example, the Dutch, for example, argue that, we have to closely watch, and supervise imams in the mosques, what's been said there, and if they advocate and speak against, Netherlands or against the people who live in Netherlands, we have to do something about it. I think that there's not much legislation about it.
I'd like to bring in David from Jerusalem. David, you wrote an interesting piece this week about some of the calls that have been made by the Israeli officials who've been encouraging the relocation of Jews in France and in Europe here to Israel. You don't think that's a good idea. I was wondering if you can explain to us why you don't think that's a good idea.
I think immigration to Israel for the Jews around the world is always a good idea. The question is the timing and when immigration should take place. Voluntary immigration, Jews have always wished to come to the Holy Land, have always wished to immigrate to the land of Israel, to the state of Israel. The problem is that it looks a bit crass when events occur across Europe and immediately the government calls for mass immigration to Israel as if there's no other solution. What I wrote in my piece is that part of the functions and duties of the state of Israel is to also protect the diaspora and diaspora Jewry and to wish for its continuity. There's a reciprocal relationship between Israel and the Jewish diaspora. The Jewish diaspora, we hope, and Israel has this sort of covenant or pact that they'll always cover Israel's back and they will protect Israel's interests and defend Israel as a Jewish state. The other side of the bargain is that Israel has to protect and defend the interests of the diaspora community and not always look for reasons why it should necessarily fill up its numbers with diaspora Jewry. It has to relay and broadcast the message across the diaspora that we consider the continuity of diaspora Jewry as a very high value. It's a high value in itself, and it's also a high value as a future feeder.
And I've spoken to people. I've spoken to people on both sides of this issue here in Israel, and it's hard to talk about Jewish immigration to Israel without it affecting domestic considerations, particularly the issue of the peace process with the Palestinians. One of the Israeli ministers today was calling on an expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank to allocate some of those for the Jewish immigrants that would be coming in from France next year, that they expect to be about 15,000. Does that in itself create a problem on the ground between what Israel's trying to do with the Palestinians and absorbing this wave of immigrants? I mean, there are some that are saying this is political opportunism by the current government ahead of elections.
My piece wasn't really about the right-left divide. It was really about the mentality of asking for immigrants to come over. I think there's probably enough space within Israel to absorb the immigrants from whichever country, and we have to divide between domestic policy and a policy as it relates to the Jewish diaspora. And that's a separate issue that I didn't write about. And my understanding, or what I would like to see, is that Israel tells diaspora Jewry that that they're looking after their protection, and if the bad comes to worse and there's no other option, then obviously they're welcome to come to Israel and wherever they wish to be and whatever their political leanings happen to be, wherever they wish to dwell. The problem is that don't diss or undermine Jewish continuity in France. And we're speaking about domestic issues. I'm worried that it might affect the domestic issues in France itself or in Europe itself. If we have such calls like that, maybe the other countries will say, look, you anyway don't want to stay in our country, you have somewhere else to go, and you're unappreciative of what we're offering you.
Thank you, David. Let me come back to you really quickly on that point, which is, do you believe Israel is doing enough to encourage immigration here? Are they in a difficult situation where they have to walk this fine balance where they try not to heavily bring in Jewish immigrants from Europe so that there are no more Jews in Europe?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I don't think it was a good idea to try to encourage, French Jews to come to Israel, because I think that...
And the French Prime Minister said that without the Jewish population, he was upset about that. He created a bit of a diplomatic... He said that if France does not have its 500,000 Jews, if they lose 100,000 Jews, France ceases to be a republic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that people people should actually leave France, not because, someone is actually trying to hurt them, only because and not because there's no other option, because they choose voluntarily to come to Israel. But I think it's not because they are forced to come to Israel. So I think instead of trying to encourage people to come to Israel, I think what the Israeli government should ask, from the French government to protect the Jews within the French territory and not to ask them to come to Israel. And to be honest with you, most people that I know in France, and I do have a big family in France, I mean, they love France. They love the country. They were born in France. They're planning to stay there for the rest of their life. Of course, they're terrified, but at the same time, they don't want to leave, So I think the solution should be not to encourage them to come to Israel unless they really want to come, but to be able to protect them, in their own country.
Okay. Dr. Esther Lepetine, thank you very much for joining us. And David Fachler, thank you very much for joining us from Jerusalem as well. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to head down to Gaza to see how reconstruction efforts are taking place down there. We turn now to the